Hello, I'm back again with another episode of that still unnamed series about historical figures and books and whatnot. In fact, since there seems to be people actually watching these videos, if you have any suggestions for names or subjects that you would like to know more about, just let me know in the comments and I'll certainly consider it. This time we're again dealing to some degree with a book, but mostly with a person. And again, we are dealing with a Muslim philosopher and historian. And this is a person that is a bit more well known than Ibn Tufayl is, and also one that is often considered to be the father of, by some people at least, the father of the science of history, sociology, and in some cases even economics. His name was Ibn Khaldun, and he wrote this amazing piece of work called the Muqaddimah, or Introduction to History. And this is not just some metaphorical or cryptic title, it literally is the introductory chapter to a much larger piece of work called the Kitab al-Ibad, or Book of Lessons, which is this enormous collection that aimed to bring together or sort of give a general overview of history and civilization in general. The Muqaddimah has been, and is to this day, however, still considered a separate piece of work that has had a great influence on both science, like I said, the science of history and sociology. Ibn Khaldun was a philosopher and historian who was born in Tunis, in what is today Tunisia, and would later go on to become one of the most famous and revered figures in Muslim history. And now the context in which he lived is, of course, incredibly important, as it always is, in understanding him or his work in a proper way. He lived in what is known as the medieval period of the Muslim world. The Abbasid Caliphate, which is sometimes referred to as the classical period, ruled much of the larger Islamic or Muslim world, at least symbolically, from around 750 AD to 1258, when, as you probably know, the Mongols, in their campaign to conquer the entire goddamn world, eventually reached Baghdad, and thus also executed the last remaining caliph. And this was obviously very traumatic for the Muslims, as their sort of main seat of power and the symbol of the grand Islamic civilization had just vanished. And so Ibn Khaldun finds himself right in the middle of this sort of trauma and this very uncertain period in Islamic history, referred to as the medieval period, which is after the fall of the Abbasids, but before the eventual rise of the Ottoman Empire. And Ibn Khaldun is perfectly placed right in between these, when the sort of Islamic world was very fragmented and ruled by a whole bunch of different regional smaller kingdoms and sultans. Ibn Khaldun then was born in 1332, like I said, in Tunis. And he came from a long lineage of statesmen and politicians from Al-Andalus, or Andalusia in Spain. His father, though, was a renowned Sufi of the time who when Ibn Khaldun grew up, would teach him a lot about his own mysticism and the Sufi tradition. On top of this, Ibn Khaldun had a lot of other teachers whom he writes very highly and fondly about. His education with these teachers included everything from Sufism to philosophy and the Quran, as well as mathematics, logics, astronomy, all these things. It's safe to say that Ibn Khaldun was a highly educated man, both in the Islamic and also the so-called worldly sciences. His early life appeared to have been rather peaceful, as he spent his time in intellectual discovery and education. But a turning point in his life came when the plague struck Tunis in North Africa. Yes, the plague was obviously not something that just affected Europe, but the entire world. And once the plague actually arrived in North Africa and in Tunis, it wiped out Ibn Khaldun's entire family, basically, except for a few siblings and his teachers. And he writes himself about this event in very sort of apocalyptic ways. Yes, I need these glasses on now because I'm going to quote him. Quote, "In the middle of the 14th century, civilization both in the East and the West was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish." He continues, "Cities and buildings were laid waste, roads and signs were obliterated, settlements and mansions became empty, dynasties and tribes grew weak, the entire inhabited world changed. It was," and here Ibn Khaldun evokes a very sort of poetic and yet apocalyptic language. "It was as if the voice of existence in the world had called out for oblivion and restriction, and the world had responded to its call." Obviously, this event affected Ibn Khaldun immensely and had a very strong impact on his life. However, it does appear that it also served as a kind of inspiration for his later career, as since the world had been so changed, there was a need for him to write critically about history and society. Ibn Khaldun was a very ambitious man, and like from directly out of a Hollywood film, he is stuck in his early working years with a job that he hates as a calligrapher and sort of dreams about better things to come. And they certainly would come, because he would leave eventually and go on to become one of the most successful political advisors of his time, and indeed of all time. He traveled all around North Africa, working for different sultans and kings. He worked for a while in Morocco, and then he was in Algeria, and even for a while he worked in Granada, in Spain, in Andalusia. While working for these sultans and kings and rulers, he came to realize how filled with jealousy and corruption the political world actually was. Rulers rose and fell in what appeared to be very short spans of time. The whole thing was just very chaotic. He was himself the victim of jealousy and some nasty schemes that at some points even put him in jail. But he was not entirely innocent himself. In fact, Ibn Khaldun was obviously a very intelligent and knowledgeable man, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. For example, if he felt like a sultan or a king he worked for, his time was running out, he would often support the rebels, unbeknownst of these sultans, so he would betray him basically. Because of its knowledge of the political world and how it worked, he could sense that the king's time was over, and in most cases he was actually correct. Even though Ibn Khaldun appears to have eventually felt a kind of disdain towards the political world that he worked in, he was nonetheless incredibly successful throughout his life, and every ruler basically wanted to work with him or have him by their side. Even the Christian king Pedro of Seville asked him to join him, to which he refused for reasons that are not entirely known, although some can make educated guesses as to why. You really start to feel for the guy, as he just wants to sort of retire and go live in seclusion with his family and write and teach. But you know, different rulers are constantly just dragging him back into service because he is so revered as this incredible political figure, or this thinker. It's almost like in the scene in The Godfather Part 3 where Michael is, you know, doing that famous line of, you know, once I thought I was out, they pull me back in. It's just really just like that, and you really feel sorry for him, as he kind of at multiple times in his life actually does withdraw, but is pulled back into service by different sultans to his sort of disdain. The last years of his life he spent in Mamluk Egypt, in Cairo, as a qadi or a judge. He was actually the main representative of the Maliki school of law in Islamic Sharia for the Sultan Barkuk, who ruled at the time. He seems to have been at this time actually rather content with his life. He enjoyed his time in Egypt, and there is some very poetic letters that he sends to his friends about Cairo and how magnificent this city is. However, there is, you know, even in Cairo, one does not escape the political corruption that he has dealt with his entire life, and he becomes almost like a Serpico figure of his time. I realize there's a lot of references to Al Pacino films in this video, but in any case it kind of fits because he would refuse to succumb to this corruption himself. and would actively fight against it, which, like in the film, created a lot of enemies. Except for the Sultan himself, actually, he appears to have stuck with him at least for the majority of his time in service. His happiness and peaceful life was unfortunately cut short, however, when most of his family, including his wife and some of his children, were tragically killed in an accident at sea. They had been separated for quite a while when Ibn Khaldun moved to Egypt, and they were finally going to meet at last again, and on the way there they were tragically killed, which sent Ibn Khaldun into a devastating depression, to which it took quite a while for him to recover. And this is very humanizing to read, to really puts things into perspective and makes us see the man behind the works, as it were. You sort of start to see him as a person rather than this legendary figure that he is often presented as. He was eventually able to get out of this depression, and he continued to work as a teacher in Cairo, and even there were some periods of tensions between him and the Sultan, which I unfortunately do not have time to go into, but generally he and the Sultan appears to have had a good relationship throughout his later years and career, and he worked as a teacher at a Sufi shrine, I believe. Ibn Khaldun eventually passes away on March 17th, 1406, having spent his life in service of a multitude of different sultans and kings, and through his writings and teachings have cemented himself in the history books. Now, throughout the years of service and his impeccable experience and close-up view of the political and social world, Ibn Khaldun was obviously able to gain a great understanding of how these worlds actually worked. This would all be expressed in the Muqaddimah and inspired a lot of its genius, really. As mentioned, the Muqaddimah is just the introductory chapter to a much larger piece of work, but it certainly stands on its own. In the book, Ibn Khaldun really tries to give a comprehensive overview of civilization and culture and politics in general. It is considered a masterpiece that has not only had a great influence on Ottoman society, but also the rest of the world, and still to some degree today. Ibn Khaldun is considered, in fact, by some to be the father of the science of history and the study of sociology. And it is in this book that he expresses a lot of those ideas. In the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun presents a view of history that is completely unique for his time. He simply doesn't want to retell things, not history just as a retelling of events, but to actually study history critically and to look at things from a rational point of view and try to explain them in a sort of a larger scientific context. Now, while the Muqaddimah is a large piece of work in itself, with a lot of content that I really don't have the time to go through today, I can talk about one of the central aspects of his political theory, which is something that he calls asabiya. And it's always difficult to translate Arabic to English, but it is generally believed to mean something along the lines of tribal solidarity. At this time, when he lived, and still to this day to some degree, Arab and Berber society is very much divided into different tribes. And all political and social workings are based on solidarity and identification with these different tribes. In fact, Ibn Khaldun considers asabiya to be the very driving force behind all of history. He argues that dynasties and empires, all dynasties and empires, are destined to go down the same path, one of rise and eventual fall. This is unavoidable, without question. Every dynasty will fall, every single time. And he uses asabiya to explain this. When a ruler comes into power, he does so with the help of asabiya, tribal solidarity, with the help of one or multiple tribes that he sometimes also belonged to, and their political support. Other factors, such as divine or religious motivations or inspirations, can be important as well. But he argues that asabiya is the sort of most important. In fact, he writes in a very blunt way and says that power does not exist without asabiya. Period. Now, after this, he argues to sort of delve deeper into this theory that every dynasty rises and falls, but it goes through certain stages, which he refers to as generations. These can be different according to, circumstances, but generally he says it doesn't last for more than 3 generations. And the first generation is good. The first generation of rulers is good. The king in this case is still strongly connected to Asabiya. He still remembers how tribal life looked like, and he still serves the people in that sense. He is connected to the social world and reality. The second generation is somewhere in between. He still has some memories of the tribal life that his father lived, for example, but he has started to adopt some luxury and excess and stuff like that. So he's in between. It still works, but it's starting to go in the wrong direction. And now the third generation is where it all falls apart. At this point, the ruler is so obsessed with luxury and excessive living that he has lost all connection to Asabiya, and thus also the support of the people. His main concern is to stay in power and not to serve the people, and thus he has been completely detached from reality. And when this happens, this is where the fall happens. So at this point, another ruler with their sort of Asabiya and their tribal support takes over, and thus the cycle sort of repeats indefinitely, forever. In other words, it is through a gradual loss of tribal Asabiya that rulers lose their power and eventually fall. It's certainly an interesting theory to consider. It's hard to deny that every dynasty and empire, at least so far in history, has fallen and nothing has lasted forever. Ibn Khaldun here presents us with a theory, an idea of why this is, the reasons for this inevitable rise and fall of every empire and every dynasty. And it is through ideas like this that he has really cemented himself as an incredibly important writer and influential thinker. Now, there are, of course, some other areas of the book where it certainly shows his age, and this is another point to where his contexts really need to be considered. There is, for example, a section that describes black Africans in a rather unfortunate way, and in this section he's trying to sort of correlate what he calls the great emotionalism of the African population with the hot climate in which they live, and sort of compares this to drunkenness when drinking wine, because the body gets hot when you drink alcohol. It's a mess. Now, this is obviously ridiculous and not just slightly racist, but it serves as an important reminder that we cannot separate him. Despite his genius in some areas, we cannot separate him from his time and place. And to consider Ibn Khaldun as somehow a modern thinker stuck in an unenlightened age is highly problematic and dangerous. This not only presents a dangerous view of history that put things out of context, but it also undermines the achievements of the medieval Muslim world. Viewing Ibn Khaldun as somehow separated from his time and place and his culture, and put in some kind of modern narrative, paints a picture that the time in which he lived was indeed unenlightened or sort of intellectually lacking, which is simply just not true. Nonetheless, Ibn Khaldun is a very important and interesting figure that deserves a lot more time than this to go through properly. But I hope you have at least enjoyed this short dive into his world and his works. I may not be the most frequent uploader on this here YouTube, but if you do have any suggestions for future episodes or ideas, then I would love to hear them. So just leave them in a comment or something. In any case, I do have some ideas myself, so there'll probably be some future videos that I have planned. Thank you for listening.